They're threatening to shut down one of the most critical oil passages in modern history. Can you believe it? That jaw-dropping warning spread like wildfire when rumors surfaced that Iran's parliament had voted to close the Strait of Hormuz. In a single moment, the global energy conversation shifted from routine market fluctuations to the ominous possibility of a massive spike in oil prices, and not by a small margin either. So, what really prompted this shocking move? And how might it leave a worldwide economic bruise reminiscent of the upheaval sparked by Russia's military action in Ukraine a few years ago? Today, we're going to untangle the twists and turns behind this story, examine the secretive diplomatic chain reactions, and figure out whether another epic economic shock could be waiting just around the corner. In this deep dive, we will explore three main questions. First, how did tensions escalate so quickly that the Iranian parliament would pass this drastic measure? Second, why does the Strait of Hormuz hold such incredible significance for both regional power brokers and global markets? And finally, who stands to lose, or possibly gain, the most if this critical passage faces any form of closure? Buckle up, because this saga interweaves everything from international politics to your wallet at the gas pump, and we'll examine every angle to make sense of this messy and enthralling drama. Before we crack open the details, let's set the stage. The world, still rattled by earlier conflicts, has kept a watchful eye on every oil shipping route over the past few years. Any hint of disruption can set off alarm bells from Washington to Beijing, from European banking hubs to small business owners relying on fuel stability. Right when Middle East watchers were discussing whether recent Iranian nuclear site strikes by the United States might trigger localized retaliatory attacks, the news of Iran's potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz landed with the force of a bombshell. That single narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula carries approximately 1/5 of global oil production. Traders on the floor of major stock exchanges began to whisper about stagflation, an economic phenomenon where inflation runs hot while growth runs cold. And they recalled how just a few years ago, the entire planet reeled from higher energy bills and supply woes following Russia's conflict with Ukraine. Suddenly, talk of a new wave of rising prices pinched some delicate nerves. Donald Trump entered the conversation with a startling announcement of a potential ceasefire between various Middle Eastern countries. According to him, the looming specter of strait closure could interfere with already shaky inflation signals in the United States. Trump's official statement, posted on his preferred social media platform, criticized oil sector players who might be tempted to jack up prices. He wrote, "I'm watching. You're playing right into the hands of the enemy. Don't do it." The assertion seemed to be a rallying cry for producers to keep costs at bay, though some insiders questioned how much influence public statements truly have in the swirling atmosphere of geopolitics. Interestingly, some experts claim the actual possibility of Iran permanently sealing off the Strait of Hormuz is slimmer than headlines convey. Paul Tice, who serves as a senior fellow at the National Center for Energy Analytics, argued that Iran may not even possess the full capability to shut it down. According to Tice, the talk might be more about signaling power, flexing a bit of political muscle, and raising the stakes in ongoing negotiations with global players. Nonetheless, many watchers note that even a brief or partial disruption could send ripples throughout the energy sector. After all, for better or worse, a sizable chunk of daily oil shipments hugging the coast of Iran eventually passes through that bottleneck. With so many nations tied to that supply, the knock-on effects for inflation and growth are huge. To add another explosive dimension, only days earlier, the United States reportedly struck Iranian nuclear sites, allegedly in an effort to curb what was described as a looming nuclear threat. The next day, Iran supposedly retaliated by attacking a U.S. military base in Qatar, leading some analysts to fear a rapid escalation. Old animosities seemed ready to boil over, stoking concerns that if these skirmishes got out of hand, the shipping routes near the Persian Gulf might become dangerously unsafe. Early Monday, oil prices actually dropped a few dollars per barrel, suggesting the market was not yet convinced that the sky was falling. But even a marginal upward swing in crude prices can warm inflation statistics globally. In a financial landscape where central banks are tiptoeing through interest rates, no one wants to toss in a brand new crisis. Susanna Cruz, research analyst at Panmure Liberum in the United Kingdom, was one of the first to declare that a full closure of the Strait of Hormuz might unleash a stagflationary shock, reminiscent of the ones that hammered economies in 2022 following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. She suggested that such a scenario could add another full percentage point to U.S. inflation rates. Although she labeled a complete closure as unlikely, Cruz explored a more realistic scenario in which oil prices still climb about 20% in the coming quarter. Such a bump alone, she pointed out, might lift consumer prices by half a percentage point in the United States, 0.4 of a point in the Eurozone, and 0.3 of a point in the United Kingdom. In an era where the Federal Reserve has repeatedly turned to interest rate hikes to tame inflation, this development might keep rates higher for longer, an outcome that rattles both corporate planners and everyday consumers. Speaking of the Federal Reserve, many wonder just how Chair Jerome Powell and others on the Board of Governors might react. The Fed has been juggling a tricky predicament. They cannot afford for inflation to spiral, but they also fear that overly aggressive interest rate moves could tip the economy into contraction. If an external oil shock materializes, it could reignite inflationary pressures right when some policymakers sense that the price surges of the last few years have begun to settle. But as Cruz reminded observers, central banks worldwide discovered in 2022 that ignoring an energy-based price spike, or prematurely calling it transitory, can backfire. If prices appear to be reaching new, sustained heights, the Fed and other monetary bodies around the globe might tighten policy or at least pause any planned easing, a far cry from the rate cuts that might have once seemed plausible. Investors on Wall Street are already bracing for a turbulence reminiscent of older cycles in which oil crises hammered equities, even if only briefly. Now, let's pivot from the Fed to the broader market reaction. Monday morning, Brent crude, the global benchmark for pricing, opened around $79 per barrel, but soon dipped closer to $70. Traders evidently questioned whether the rumored Iranian plan would be enacted, or if swirling diplomatic efforts might keep the waterway open. Meanwhile, President Trump's brand of public persuasion tries to shape the narrative that the oil sector must keep prices affordable, though some say the real power lies not in tweets, but in behind-the-scenes deals with drilling giants and foreign allies. Skeptics caution that a single political misstep could again jolt prices upward. If you find that revelation surprising, now would be a great time to give a thumbs up and share this story so others can learn about the intricate factors spurring potential oil market chaos. Every small gesture helps shine a spotlight on these vital issues. Ethan Harris, a former chief economist at Bank of America, weighed in on the ongoing drama, telling the press that as worrisome as these energy tensions might sound, the brewing global trade war could pose an even larger threat to stable prices. According to Harris, while the United States is substantially less reliant on foreign oil imports than it was in the early 1990s, when events like the Gulf War contributed to massive oil shock aftershock, the country cannot insulate itself entirely from global wave effects. Harris pointed out that for many Americans, the memory of the last few big oil spikes, and for Europeans, the unstoppable energy inflation triggered by the Russia-Ukraine fighting remains all too fresh. Yet his stance is that a prolonged spat over trade tariffs and supply chain disruptions might overshadow even a jump in energy costs because it worms its way into every facet of daily goods, from electronics to groceries. A shining example of how quickly circumstances can change was the Monday slump in oil prices of roughly $3 per barrel. That might sound reassuring, but Goldman Sachs analysts caution it could simply be the eye of the storm. They predicted that if half of the nearly 20 million barrels passing through the Strait of Hormuz each day were blocked for about a month, the price of Brent crude could skyrocket to $110 per barrel, raising the geopolitical risk premium from around $12 a barrel into the mid-20s. That's the kind of price shift that keeps economists awake at night, or at least scribbling frantically on their notepads. And remember, if you scale down from a full closure to a partial one, the repercussions might be less severe, but still notable. This potential scenario also involves the United States, China, and various OPEC members exploring alternative shipping routes, including overland pipelines that could theoretically bypass the tight corridor, though those backup options come with added complexity and cost. All the frantic speculation begs a question. Why on earth would Iran pursue an action that might damage its own economy? Iran itself still depends on oil exports to sustain a large chunk of government revenue. By blocking the strait, Iranian leaders risk severing a major artery vital to their own interests. But from the vantage of Iranian hawks, the threat alone may be a powerful bargaining chip. If the rest of the world truly believes the Iranian parliament is serious, Tehran might capitalize on the unease by demanding relief from international sanctions or more favorable conditions in any nuclear negotiations. In essence, it's a game of chicken on a global scale, with each side hoping the other blinks first. On the other side, the roles of Israel and Qatar have also come into focus. Jerusalem has remained guarded on confirming the rumored ceasefire, while Doha has expressed concern over the plausible hostility in their region. Meanwhile, Macquarie Bank strategists published a note teaching a possible workaround if the strait were to be blocked, pointing out that countries in the Gulf could reroute some oil by land. However, they also warned that if Iran launched any direct attacks on major oil production sites, the repercussions go well beyond a simple shipping detour. That's when watchers start uttering words like recession, referencing the chokehold that expensive energy can impose on the entire global system. Even after seeing how fragile the supply chain can be, many from the energy analytics world continue to believe that the possibility of the strait truly closing is remote. Nevertheless, the mere idea of closure has re-energized discussions around how effectively the global economy can handle new disruptions. Officials from the Eurozone have been on high alert, well aware that Europe has spent the past few years trying to reduce its reliance on uncertain energy partners. Any fresh volatility in crude markets could easily feed into the cost of living across the continent, with immediate political consequences for leaders who have already battled restive populations over inflation pressures. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, the debate about potential interest rate hikes resurfaces every time oil crosses certain key price thresholds. Stories about households struggling with skyrocketing bills quickly inflame public debates over domestic policy. Keeping all these factors in the spotlight, it's essential to remember just how big the energy puzzle is. We're not merely talking about families paying more at the gas station or factory managers fretting over electricity costs. The backbone of global trade is deeply woven into the reliability of these major shipping routes. The commodities that feed entire industries rely on consistent flows of oil. That synergy is why so many people reference the stagflation fears from the early 2022 conflict in Ukraine. The entire economy can, in turn, slow to a crawl as cost pressures mount while consumer purchasing power declines. But somewhere in this swirl of speculation is the voice of caution. Maybe, just maybe, a jolt of diplomacy might cool everything down. Remember, President Trump boasted of a possible ceasefire in the region, especially aimed at easing tensions between adversaries. If that truce holds, it could be the step needed to reassure global markets. Already, Iranian officials have expressed skepticism about the longevity of any truce until Israel and the United States verify it. If everyone can come together for a few weeks of measured dialogue, we might avoid reaching that tipping point. Indeed, a short-term settlement or a temporary maritime oversight arrangement could be hammered out. But, as many commentators have pointed out, we've seen these near misses before, and the next spark might reignite smoldering embers half a world away. Now, what about those ripple effects beyond the Middle East or the United States? Emerging economies often feel the pinch of expensive oil more acutely. Countries with delicate currency balances can experience immediate strain if forced to pay more for imported energy. In regions with developing infrastructure, the cost of shipping can rise drastically, slowing trade flows and denting economic aspirations. The very mention of a new energy crisis can lead central banks in such locations to scramble for solutions, often raising interest rates prematurely to stem capital flight. These smaller nations become the silent victims of such large-scale geopolitical tug-of-wars, overshadowed by the more powerful players. Analysts also remind us that psychological fear alone can be enough to shift consumer behaviors. If people believe that gas prices will climb and stay high, they might trim spending in other areas, especially discretionary purchases. That belt tightening eventually feeds into weaker prospects for certain business sectors, fueling anxiety in stock markets. This synergy between speculation, caution, and reality can quickly form a feedback loop. Rumors spur caution, caution drives actual cuts in spending, and those cuts confirm or exacerbate the original worry. That kind of dynamic played out in 2022, and some worry it could easily resurface if major tension in the Persian Gulf blossoms. By this point in the story, you might be on the edge of your seat, wondering, will the ceasefire hold, or is it just smoke and mirrors? If you want more investigation into it, or you're keen to stay tuned for future breakdowns of how these global events really affect your everyday life, Please consider subscribing now so you never miss our deep dive updates. Of course, some voices are urging the public not to catastrophize every rumor emerging from the Middle East. There is a sense that rational minds on all sides know too well the devastation that a fully blocked Strait of Hormuz might cause. Even so, the unpredictable factor of domestic politics in each country contributes to the constant risk of escalation. In Iran, ardent factions may genuinely want to demonstrate that foreign interference has gone too far, believing that showing strength is worth the financial pain. In the United States, a variety of political figures may consider hawkish stances an opportunity to rally domestic support, particularly if accusations are made that the other side is trying to hold the global economy hostage. Meanwhile, allied nations in the region watch with both hope and dismay, hope that cooler heads will prevail, dismay at how quickly the pot can boil over. It's also essential to remember that the world's dependency on oil, while still high, is gradually evolving. Alternative energy sources, from solar to wind to electric vehicles, have grown in prominence. Nevertheless, that transition has not yet removed global reliance on oil for a broad swath of everyday usage. So, even though certain economies are less susceptible to an oil shock than in decades past, the combined share of countries still reliant on these refined products can be large enough to stir worldwide trouble when supply lines face real or rumored threats. In many ways, this entire scenario has become a masterclass in how a regional confrontation can ripple outward to cause a global storm. One day, a piece of news about a parliamentary vote in Tehran sets off fresh waves of anxiety. The next day, an unverified ceasefire emerges, and markets breathe a temporary sigh of relief, only to revert to worry when talk of retaliatory strikes in Qatar or rumored nuclear programs rears its head again. Throw into that mixture major players like the Federal Reserve, which has a direct hand in shaping economic sentiment and controlling monetary policy, and you begin to see why the phrase perfect storm isn't too far-fetched. Donald Trump, no stranger to the art of the strong public statement, has found himself again in the role of informal commentator, reminding drilling companies they must not let prices spiral out of control. Yet behind the scenes, government agencies in multiple nations likely scramble to keep shipping lanes open. International watchdogs track every movement of Iranian vessels, and the intelligence community looks for any hint that missiles or sabotage devices might be headed to choke off commerce. The drama intensifies because it's never entirely clear where grandstanding ends and real strategic planning begins. The stakes are sky high, especially for families in all corners of the globe who might be forced to choose between paying for pricier energy or cutting back on essentials. Consider also how swiftly all of this has ramped up in a matter of days. What started as arguments about nuclear facilities escalated into real strikes. Then, the Iranian parliament voted in favor of shutting down a passage. Next, alleged retaliations on foreign bases stoked fear of war. Finally, the White House stepped up to announce a ceasefire, or at least an attempt at it. The roller coaster effect is astonishing, and it mirrors the unpredictability markets love to hate. Remember, it's not just about big banks and giant corporations. Smaller businesses and everyday workers stand to be impacted by the chain reaction of higher prices, slower growth, or even battered consumer confidence. Economies run on optimism as much as on raw capital, so the sense that trouble might be brewing can itself create or exacerbate actual trouble. Yet for all the worst-case scenarios and hand-wringing, analysts still say not to expect an outright closure. They remind us that some players in Iran's top leadership ranks must realize the closure of the strait would hamper Iran's own oil shipments. Contracting exports to a trickle or zero does the country no favors, especially in dire economic times. There's a calculus here. Yes, threatening the closure is a statement, but actually doing it could lead to unintended blowback that cripples Iran's economy, triggers even harsher sanctions, and fuels unpredictable military responses from unlikely coalitions. Some experts even propose that Iranian lawmakers are using the parliament's closure vote as a rhetorical tactic to show domestic constituents that they're willing to go to extremes for national pride. Still, in the end, we can't ignore the meaty possibility that one misstep or miscommunication could lead to a fiasco. We saw throughout history that shipping lanes can become flashpoints. When tensions run high across a region, a single provocative event, a boarded tanker, a lost drone, a missile that hits the wrong target, could spark real conflict. That anxious climate might be enough for the entire global economic community to recalculate, piling risk premiums onto every transaction, from insurance to currency exchanges to the cost of borrowing. From the vantage point of this moment, the best hope is that cooler heads find a path forward. The Middle East is no stranger to tangled alliances, and in times of crisis, broad mediation efforts have stepped in before. If official verification of the ceasefire comes from all parties, the short-term fear might start to subside. Diplomatic backchannels possibly remain open. Even when leaders trade barbs publicly, their envoys might be quietly hashing out face-saving agreements. After all, it benefits few to push the price of oil to triple digits if there's still an opportunity to keep shipping lines open. As you can see, the ingredients for a global economic tremor are all present. A strategic waterway crucial for a fifth of the world's oil, a tense geopolitical environment, swirling inflation fears, tight monetary policies, and supply chains still reeling from recent conflicts. The big question is whether we'll let that mixture sit quietly or stir it up until it overflows. While we wait, analysts like Susanna Cruz and Ethan Harris continue issuing their forecasts, reminding everyone that even speculative chatter can be enough to unsettle an economy still recovering from earlier slowdowns. It all circles back to that dramatic first vow from Iranian lawmakers: close the Strait of Hormuz. For the moment, the official stance in Tehran remains somewhat hazy, as the Supreme National Security Council might or might not endorse the parliament's vote. Meanwhile, Iranian media occasionally broadcast images meant to assure that the threat is real. On the flip side, White House officials have neither confirmed nor denied the precise details of the supposed new peace deal. Under these conditions, markets can become hyper-reactive, bouncing from calm to panic at the faintest rumor. Nevertheless, the historical track record suggests we won't necessarily see a catastrophic lockdown of the strait tomorrow. Instead, we're more likely to witness an ongoing tug-of-war, where each side edges as close as they can without pushing the world into a deeper economic crisis. The memory of the Russia-Ukraine energy disruptions stands as a stark lesson in just how high the stakes can climb if major suppliers decide to weaponize their resources. For many, that lesson is enough to give diplomats and political leaders serious pause before letting the temperature rise further. So, dear viewers, keep your eyes on the signals. If the ceasefire is validated by Iran and Israel, watch for oil prices to edge lower and stock markets to breathe a sigh of relief. If not, brace yourself for a ride in which mentions of stagflation, rate hikes, and global downturn once again become the daily headlines. Let's hope we don't end up following that perilous script. Until we see which direction this unpredictable storyline heads, the biggest takeaway is that global connections are more fragile than we often care to admit. A single waterway can be a make-or-break factor for the cost of living around the planet. That's why no one can afford to look away. Not governments, not corporations, not investors, and certainly not regular folks who notice the cost of things like fuel, groceries, and shipping fees creeping up. The threads that tie the global economy together can unravel with surprising speed. Whichever turn of events awaits us in this high-stakes theater, rest assured we'll be back with more insights as everything continues to unfold. Thank you for diving into this whirlwind with me today. Stay tuned for more updates and stay alert to the delicate state of international relations in regions that just might control the energy spigot for the rest of the